Welcome to our first lecture of week 5 of the spring semester 2021 for President's Day, February 15th, 2021. Before we get started on today's lecture, I want to once again issue a friendly reminder for your first primary source analysis assignment. Primary source analysis assignment number 1 is due by the end of the day, quite literally the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. Central Time on Thursday of this week. That's Thursday, February 18th. So please do not forget to submit your completed essays to Safe Assign by the end of the day on Thursday. And now that that bit of housekeeping is out of the way, let's discuss the agricultural environment in America in the late 19th century. We discussed the industrial era a week ago with discussion of Gilded Age industrialization in America and the the formation of labor unions and protests and strikes and things of that nature, as there was a tremendous separation in terms of income and in wealth between the very few at the top of these giant corporations and the bulk of their employees, their everyday rank and file, ordinary workers. There was similar economic anxiety in the South and the Great Plains and the West with farmers and the agricultural community. And so we will discuss that in today's lecture. We'll also talk about the alliances that they made to try to improve their situation at the grassroots level before finally trying to use political action as an instrument for change and to alleviate their financial hardships. So we will continue by taking a look at economic anxiety. Now, if you followed the recent 2020 presidential campaign, economic anxiety was a significant issue in that campaign. You probably undoubtedly heard about the white working class, blue-collar workers, people of that ilk that feel like they've been left behind with globalization and the current economy. But if we go back into the late 1880s, the late 1800s, the 19th century, you can find a similar strand of economic anxiety throughout rural America, small town America, back in that era as well. Much like the factory workers of the industrial Northeast and the Midwest, the farmers in the South, and the Great Plains in the West during this time period also faced tremendous financial hardship. There was a tremendous amount of income inequality between the individual farmers, small business owners in those regions, and the giant corporations that were sweeping across America and controlling the nation's business and financial sector. And so when we take a look at the region and its working class people, farmers make up a significant chunk of the rural American workforce during this time period. And farming has always been a difficult profession because there are very fickle and unpredictable challenges that result from weather and from just the local markets. You can't control the weather, and from time to time, severe weather could significantly impact your harvest, the crops that you were able to produce in any given year, and also the market value of those crops locally was subject to change periodically from year to year, quarter to quarter, things like that. So those were conditions that farmers were by and large used to by the late 1860s and into the 1870s. But as I talked about earlier this semester, with the advent of the railroads and the construction of railroads across the Great Plains and into the West, that really proved to be a game changer in terms of economic growth nationwide, but especially within those regions. Unfortunately, it brought quite a bit of new expenses for the agricultural workers and farmers of those regions. All of a sudden, they had to contend with new economic power brokers, including bankers, railroad companies, and corporations, in addition to the still present and fickle weather and local markets that they had always been dealing with. And in particular, railroad companies began to charge higher freight rates in order to transport the farmers' products from the rural America to the cities in the east and the urban centers in the east and the industrial Midwest. In addition, food processors and warehouses also began to charge higher rates to hold the food, process the food and the crops, particularly if the farmers could not get a fair price on the marketplace. They would want to store their crop in a warehouse until hopefully the market turned around. And what that meant was that individual farmers really had no significant leverage to speak of by themselves. They couldn't, much like their factory worker counterparts in the industrial Northeast and Midwest, they couldn't just take on the corporate elite, take on the robber barons individually. They had no real leverage and basically had to pay these high rates from middlemen, third-party operators, if you will. In addition, tariffs were in place from the federal government that protected American manufacturing companies from foreign competitors. That had a byproduct that of these tariffs ultimately wound up hurting farmers, because that meant that with no foreign competition, the American industrial companies could sell their machinery and other equipment to farmers at much higher rates because they controlled the market. The farmers couldn't purchase those similar items from foreign companies. Also, exporting goods was a significant source of income for farmers, but the tariffs made it increasingly difficult for farmers to export their crops to foreign markets. This resulted in a surplus of crops in the domestic market, and that ultimately drove prices down. So the end result of all of these economic challenges faced by farmers, from paying middlemen that they previously had not had to deal with, to tariffs that made it increasingly expensive to acquire necessary equipment to harvest their plant and harvest their crops, as well as the same tariffs that made it harder for them to sell their crops abroad. farmers wound up in debt. We talked about tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South earlier in the semester, and they used a portion of their crops to cover the cost of equipment that they used, as well as the land that they used from whoever the property owner was in the South. So they're already working with maybe half, maybe 2/3 of the crop they produce to actually take to market. Meanwhile, in the West, farmers took out mortgages on their land in order to pay for the equipment and the land, which resulted in their accruing debt. A lack of diversity in crops made it more difficult for farmers in both regions to get maximum value for their goods, as corn and wheat were, generally speaking, the primary crops in the West and on the Great Plains, and cotton was the primary crop in the South. So when that's basically what the majority of farmers are producing in each region, all of a sudden buyers have a plethora of options to acquire their corn and wheat or acquire their cotton, and that drives prices down as well, and it hurts the individual farmers. And you can see in the left-hand corner of this slide a lithograph of a farmer exclaiming in the center of the image that he's the one that provides the food and nourishment for all of these people that are white-collar workers, industrialists, and wealthy elite in cities on the East Coast and in the industrial Midwest. And you can see it says, "I feed you all," in the center of the lithograph there. So the farmer is feeling unappreciated, and certainly has feelings of great economic anxiety during this time period. So, what are you to do if you are a farmer in the later years of Reconstruction and into the mid to late 1870s and 1880s? Individually, you really have very little power. So, because of that, very similar to the industrial workers in the Northeast, organization as a group, as a collective outlet became very, very popular during this time. It strengthened numbers, and if we could band together into a large group, then perhaps we can get the change that we want through political action or through some other sorts of business arrangements. So one of in fact, the very earliest organization that worked collectively for farmers during this time period was the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, founded in 1867, known simply as the Grange. And the Grange attracted numerous farmers to join. Within a decade of its founding, by 1874, the Grange had 1.5 million members nationwide, and it more or less functioned as an avenue for farmers to create cooperative alliances so that they could buy and sell their crops collectively without using third parties and middlemen such as railroad operators and food processors. So let's cut out the middlemen in our business and pool our resources together to be able to take it to market ourselves without the use of a third party. Then we can sell for higher rates and ultimately bring in more revenue for our our goods and our products. As the 1870s wore on, the Grange began to venture out from merely cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, into political action as another avenue to reduce their financial struggles. They specifically lobbied local politicians to create laws that would provide state regulation of railroads and crop warehouses so that operators of those facilities would not be able to overcharge farmers for their services. And they were successful, actually, in getting some state regulation of those industries, and some of those laws, local laws, even held up upon court challenge. However, the organization as a whole, the Grange, began to splinter by the end of the 1870s, as part of the organization wanted to focus primarily on the co-op business groups, and while the other part wanted to become further entrenched and involved in the political process to enact change through policy. So, out of the Farmers Alliance, much like the American Federation of Labor succeeded the Knights of Labor that I talked about in Friday's lecture, the Farmers Alliances comes in the wake of the Granger movement and the Grange. The Alliance movement also basically had the same goals as the Grange. They wanted to alleviate the economic hardships faced by farmers through collective action. It was a group that consisted of small, independent farmers, whereas the Grange was sort of open to farmers of all shapes and sizes and types. They had some large, what we might even refer to as corporate farms, in addition to the individual farmers. But the alliances wanted to basically be more of a grassroots organization, focusing on small, independent farmers rather than larger organizations. And they sort of maintained this grassroots personality, a grassroots ethos, if you will. In Texas, the Alliance's movement, which was all white at the time, they allowed an African-American group to spin off and form their own alliance, the Colored Farmers National Alliance. That was formed in 1886, and the white alliance movement in Texas was okay with the Colored Alliance because the Colored Alliance sought primarily economic justice for their crops and did not push for social equality. But the southern states were not as friendly toward the Colored Farmers National Alliance as their western counterparts had been, and ultimately that led to the Colored Farmers Alliance disbanding in the early 1890s. So I mentioned the emphasis on political action to enact change, to help alleviate the financial challenges faced by the independent farmer, the small businessman. All of this sort of comes to a head in the early 1890s. They pressure the Democratic Party to nominate candidates that would align with the farmers' economic objectives, and that worked, particularly in the midterm elections of 1890. Tom Watson of Georgia became one of the Democrats who sort of aligned himself, politically speaking, with the Farmers Alliance. But outside of the South, the the Farmers Alliance movement and their membership felt left behind by both national political parties, as some of the folks in contemporary America who have economic anxiety due to a variety of factors, white working class, as well as people of color in the working class segment that lose manufacturing jobs and things like that. Sometimes depending on the group and the region and the locality, many of them will tell you that they feel that they've been left behind by the contemporary political parties in America and are more willing to either vote third party or vote for an outside-the-box candidate, as they did in 2016 for Donald Trump, a non-politician at the time that he ran. So that was a similar situation with the farmers in the Midwest and the West and even in the East back in the 1890s. And they decided to form their own political party as opposed to joining their Southern farmer counterparts in the Democratic Party. So the new political party that they formed was called the People's Party. Also, it became known as the Populist Party, but officially it was known as the People's Party. It was founded in 1891. In 1892, the People's Party held its first national convention in Omaha, Nebraska, specifically to devise an official party platform and to select candidates for the presidency and the vice presidency in the 1892 election. And they came up with a very long and radical list of ideas that they wanted to implement that were their official party objectives. And I listed most of them here on this slide. There were some that I did not list, as it was a pretty extensive party platform. But here are some of the things that the People's Party wanted back in 1892 when they came up with their official party platform and nominated candidates for the presidential election that year. They wanted the unlimited coinage of silver and an increase in the money supply. Silver at the time was being mined out west in the western United States, and it was plentiful. And they felt that silver would create inflation in the market that would allow them to pay their bills if America wasn't exclusively on the gold standard at the time. They wanted bimetallism, but especially they wanted the unlimited coinage of silver. They also wanted sub-treasuries to be created. These were sort of like a warehouse and a bank all in one. They wanted a federal sub-treasuries that would serve as warehouses to store crops and also extend loans to farmers who used those warehouses while waiting for market prices to rise and to become higher. So if you were a farmer, and you had crops ready to go to market, but the price was below what you felt was reasonable, the idea of storing them in a sub-treasury controlled by the federal government, in which you could receive a loan from the federal government as opposed to paying a grain operator, a third-party middleman, to store your crops. That was appealing to the People's Party from an economic standpoint, and that was what they were advocating. They also wanted a graduated income tax in which workers with higher incomes would pay higher rates. They wanted the federal government to nationalize the railroads and the telephone and telegraph systems to make transportation and communications easier to access and more affordable for small businessmen and for the individual small farmers. They wanted the government to reclaim any surplus land owned by railroads and corporations. In other words, land that had been that was owned by companies or railroads, but not in use for railroad tracks or depots or corporate factories or facilities. They wanted that land to be reclaimed by the government, and they wanted to prevent immigrants who were not citizens from being able to own land, either this type of land or other land in these sort of agricultural hotbeds of the U.S. In addition, they wanted tighter immigration laws. We talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act a few weeks ago and how that was specifically designed to exclude Chinese laborers who were willing to perform the hard labor, manual labor, working class jobs, including building railroads. Those were the types of immigration laws that they wanted the federal government to enact, and they wanted those laws to go beyond just Chinese laborers. They wanted, basically white Protestants to have the lion's share of land available, jobs available to them, as opposed to immigrants. And it's also important to note, and we'll get into this a little bit later this week, but it's important to note that immigrants from parts of Europe, including places like Italy, and Eastern Europe, especially Poland, for example, immigrants to the U.S. during the 1880s and 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, the 1900s, they were not considered white. They were considered immigrants who were non-white, and thus on a lower social plane in the minds of white Americans, particularly white Americans of Anglo-Saxon ancestry and Protestant Christian religion, which was most of the nation at that time. But they wanted stricter immigration laws. They also wanted the establishment of an 8-hour workday, much like the unions, the industrial unions that we talked about last week. They also wanted direct elections of U.S. senators. Back in this time, ordinary voters did not vote for the U.S. Senate. The Senate consisted of politicians who had been appointed by the state government in each state. So they wanted to be able to elect U.S. senators on their own and not have to rely on the local political establishment in power in each state at the time. They also wanted a secret ballot system in elections, and they felt that would help reduce partisanship and political influences if there was a secret ballot system in place. So those were just a few of the objectives and positions of the People's Party platform in 1892 that they came up with at their convention in Omaha, right as the 1892 presidential campaign was in full swing. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner of this slide a couple of campaign pins, campaign buttons for the People's Party during this era, showing support for the People's Party in the 1890s. Unfortunately for the People's Party, also known as the Populists, the candidate that they nominated for president in 1892, James B. Weaver, was a rather bland candidate who certainly got some support, but he fell well short of getting elected. He won over 1 million votes, and that worked out to be about 10% of the popular vote in America at this time in this election. He also won 22 votes in the Electoral College, but as I mentioned, he fell well short of Grover Cleveland, the Democratic nominee in the race, who defeated Republican incumbent Benjamin Harrison. Cleveland had been elected in 1884 to the presidency and then had lost a re-election in 1888 to Harrison, and he ran again in 1892 and defeated both Harrison and the populist candidate James B. Weaver of Iowa, making Grover Cleveland the first and to date only American president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So fast forward 4 years, and we get to the 1896 election. There was a significant financial crisis that emerged in 1893, the Panic of 1893. We talked a little bit about the Panic of 1873 a few weeks ago. This was similar, but on a much larger scale. So it was a pretty major financial depression that America found itself mired in by 1896. And with that, with those circumstances, the monetary standard became one of the major central issues of the 1896 presidential campaign. The issue of unlimited coinage of silver versus the gold standard, and how would that, which of those options would America go with in the long run, and how would that affect the overall monetary policy and monetary standard for the country at the time. The Republicans nominated William McKinley of Ohio. McKinley made it quite clear in this campaign that he preferred the gold standard, and that was supported by his fellow Republicans. He spoke about it, and that was his stance on the issue, essentially keeping it status quo from a financial standpoint. The Democrats countered with William Jennings Bryan, one of the more dynamic speakers in American political history, one of the great orators in American history, and one of the more prominent presidential candidates who never won the office. Bryan was a very young congressman from Nebraska in 1896. He was 35 years old, and at the Democratic convention, he delivered a captivating speech in which he expressed support for free coinage of silver. This speech is very well known. It's referred to as the Cross of Gold speech, as that particular phrase is evident in was uttered by Bryan in the most famous excerpt from the speech, and it earned him the nomination for the Democratic Party for the 1896 presidential election. And it's important to note that that Bryan, who was a Baptist and very religious man, devout Baptist, that his speaking style was very similar to a super effective evangelical preacher. That was the way he was able to talk and command the attention and the hearts and minds of his audience. So the Cross of Gold speech earned William Jennings Bryan the Democratic nomination in the election of 1896. The populists weren't exactly sure what to do when Bryan was chosen as the Democratic nominee. They flirted with the idea of having their own candidate, but eventually they joined forces with the Democrats and backed Bryan as well. The campaign of the 1896 election, the presidential campaign, is one of the more fascinating campaigns in American history, as there was a significant contrast in styles. Bryan decided to use the railroads, use the relatively modern transportation to crisscross the nation and give numerous speeches. He would ride the railroad cars all over the country, stop and give a speech from the back of the railroad car, or give a speech on the depot, at the depot, often extemporaneously. And many of these speeches had the same themes. He ripped corporations. He ripped the wealthy elite of the Northeast, vowing to support what he called the struggling masses of individual farmers, small business owners, and laborers. In short, his campaign was based on leveling the playing field economically for the little guy against the giant, large-scale corporations of this era. Meanwhile, McKinley opted to stay at home during this campaign, and instead of traveling across the nation the way that we see modern candidates do, or at least the way they did in a pre-2020 election cycle that was dominated by COVID, McKinley stayed at home and engaged in what was known as a front porch campaign. It was a similar tactic that had been employed by James A. Garfield in the election of 1880, and also by Benjamin Harrison in the election of 1888. And the idea was you would have scheduled campaign events at your house. You would welcome small groups of supporters, several dozen, maybe even 100 or more, but not large crowds. You would welcome them to your house. You would greet them on the front porch and deliver a speech. The speech was always prepared, nothing extemporaneous or off the cuff. And then you would receive the visitors in sort of a receiving line in your home, and where there would be refreshments and alcohol and things like that available to them. And so that's what McKinley did. He stayed home and just welcomed different groups on different days to come over and hear him speak. He also had some surrogates that were out in the field and speaking on his behalf elsewhere. But McKinley's strategy proved effective, partly due to a massive edge in campaign spending. The Republican Party attracted big business investments from some of the big corporations that Bryan and the Democrats/populists were attacking. They backed McKinley in order to win the White House. McKinley's campaign spent about 5 times as much money in 1896 as Bryan's campaign. McKinley wound up winning the election. He defeated Bryan by about 600,000 votes total in the popular vote, and he won the Electoral College by nearly 100 votes, a margin of 271 to 176. Regionally, McKinley carried the Northeast and the urban centers of the Midwest, and particularly some of the states in the Great Plains area, Midwest area, Great Lakes area, I should say, Minnesota and Ohio and some of those states, whereas Bryan won most of the West and most of the South. But it's important to note that part of the reason McKinley won, in addition to his spending edge and that he represented status quo, was that he was able to keep the Northeastern industrial workers, by and large, in his corner, and also some of the immigrants that had come over and had established themselves as workers and citizens. Some of those folks were turned off by Bryan's religious fervor and his Baptist faith. They thought that it was perhaps a little too close to white supremacy or close to anti-immigration for their tastes. But that was the election of 1896. McKinley won, and the status quo prevailed. America remained on the gold standard and officially kind of rewrote it into law in 1900. As for William Jennings Bryan, he wound up running again in the election of 1900. He lost again, and then he ran one more time in 1908, lost in that election as well. He later served as Secretary of State in the cabinet of Woodrow Wilson. So an interesting character, like I said earlier, one of the more prominent losers of presidential elections in American history. That will wrap up our discussion today on farmers, the agricultural movement, and farmers' alliances, and the People's Party / populism of the late 19th century. We'll shift gears again later this week as we move into the early stages of the progressive era on Wednesday, and I will speak to you again on Wednesday.